Okay, so for this class, we're going to talk about the executive branch. Obviously, the power of the president has grown significantly since it was first founded. You can see one example of this here in the growth of the presidential cabinet. Now, when Washington first became president of the United States, you basically only had a handful of different cabinet posts, not including the vice president. You had the Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of War, which since 1947 has been renamed the Secretary of Defense or the Department of Defense, and the Attorney General. Since then, you can see the enormous growth of the presidential cabinet since then. Basically, speaking to the expansive nature of the power of the presidency. Here you can see an even larger example of this. This might be somewhat hard to read, but the yellow basically covers the executive branch. You can see, again, the various cabinet departments beneath that. In the lowest bar, the yellow bar, you can see even other agencies that exist within the federal government as well. I apologize if that's somewhat hard to read. I'm not that concerned with detailing every single government agency that exists. Just want to give some kind of diagram or indication to suggest that the power of the presidency has grown significantly, of course, since its founding. Now, do you see this expansion of power take place? You could say in a very sort of gradual way, it has happened since the founding of the country. There are, of course, certain presidential administrations which tend to be, focused on the most for sort of increasing the power of the presidency. One of which, of course, is Lincoln during the Civil War. But in many ways, FDR is considered to be the first modern president of the United States. Under his administration, the power of the presidency grew significantly, more or less kind of taking on the role that it has now. So what I really want to get into, though, is this idea of so-called presidential cycles that exist. And this is what is covered in the book by Stephen Skowronek, The Politics Presidents Make, which I asked people to read for this class, part of it, of course. Why I like this idea of presidential cycles is that, it encompasses a lot of the historical context of the presidency. So, in other words, when people evaluate the presidency, they tend to focus on the individual characteristics of the president themselves, which I think, doesn't really tell you all that much. I mean, yes, in theory, you can evaluate each president as an individual person, but the idea that there are going to be significant differences between the presidencies just based on their individual characteristics, I don't think really tells you all that much. Now, some people would say, well, then you can look at the party that the president belongs to. And the party identification kind of tells you a little bit more. The Democratic Party stands for certain things. The Republican Party stands for certain things, for example. So depending on what party the president belongs to, that will tell you, again, more about what the president is bringing, basically, to the office. Now, that tells you a little bit more than maybe just focusing on the individual characteristics of the president. But I would also argue that that itself is kind of limited as well. And I think that, Skowronek's idea of presidential cycles tells you more because, again, it locates each, presidency within a certain historical context. And basically what he does is that he groups certain presidential administrations together into these cycles. And really what it also tells you is that the party identification really does not matter all that much. Depending on what historical period that you're looking at, you'll see sways within the Democratic Party and sways within the Republican Party. Basically, Skowronek highlights 5 different presidential cycles, beginning actually with Jefferson. Washington and Adams, I suppose, is too brief to constitute a cycle. Most of these cycles last for a number of years. The Jeffersonian cycle lasted almost 30 years. The Jacksonian cycle lasted a similar amount of time. Some of the cycles are quite long. So he highlights the Republican cycle that begins with Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, or preceding the Civil War. That cycle lasts almost 75 years, basically up until 1932. Then the New Deal cycle, which begins with the election of Roosevelt, basically lasts until almost 50 years until the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Now, there's controversy over whether or not the so-called Reagan cycle, has come to an end. Skowronek in his original book is writing in 1993 and does not argue, does not believe that the Reagan cycle has ended at that point. In his later book from 2008, he seems to be somewhat ambivalent on this idea. He seems to be, treating much more of a kind of open-ended question whether or not the election of Barack Obama marks the end of the Reagan cycle. Now, I can say with all confidence, looking at it in hindsight, that no, the Reagan cycle has not ended with the election of Barack Obama, nor did it end with the election of Joe Biden in 2020 as well. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that as we go through the class. Now, you might argue that, well, 1980 was a long time ago. I mean, certainly it must have ended by then. Well, it's only about less than 45 years. So, the New Deal cycle lasted longer than that. The Republican cycle lasted longer than that. So, I mean, just based on that length of time, that there's no reason to conclude that the cycle must have ended by now. And of course, it could go on to become the longest presidential cycle in history. Who knows? What constitutes these cycles, though, is that there's a certain kind of continuity within each presidential administration. There are certain policies, there are certain aspects of each presidential administration that they have in common that fall within these cycles. And yes, the cycles begin and obviously end, obviously, at some point. But essentially, what Skowronek is arguing here, and which I think is a compelling argument, is that during the New Deal era, for example, even though you had a couple of Republican administrations during this period of time, that the Republican administrations tend to more or less govern according to the sort of core ideas of the New Deal. President Nixon, famously, expressed this idea when he said, "We're all Keynesians now," meaning this adoption of Keynesian economics, which is again highly associated with the New Deal policies of that era. Basically, government intervention into the economy, a kind of regulated capitalist system versus more of a free market capitalist system, or less government intervention into the economy. For the purposes of creating social welfare. I don't want to get tripped up here. See, because again, the idea of the Reagan cycle is the idea, in theory, of a return to the free market economic policies. But really, the government never really left the economy. What did lessen was the government's commitment to providing for social welfare, to regulating capitalism, to ensure a greater standard of social welfare for people as a whole. The government continues to intervene in the economy, but it intervenes in the economy on the basis of favoring capital, basically. And of course, most notably expressed through the rapidly increasing military budget of the United States, which continued to increase during the Reagan years as well. So even though Republican administrations during the New Deal cycle tended to conform more closely to the policies of the New Deal, towards which was begun obviously under a Democratic administration, conversely, during the Reagan era, during the Reagan cycle, Democratic administrations tended to govern more closely to the core ideas of the Reagan administration. That would include Clinton, Obama, and even Biden. I would argue, at least. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. I think that's the thing most people probably don't realize, that today's Democratic, party has more in common with Ronald Reagan than it does with Franklin Roosevelt, despite attempts to, portray, Biden as the most progressive president since FDR, is something which I'll have more of a comment on later on in the class. But that's essentially, the key idea of these presidential cycles. That's why I think it's an interesting idea. And it kind of gives you a more sort of, condensed, understanding of the presidency, right? Rather than having to memorize who every single president was. Many of them, of course, were very, mediocre figures. You essentially, again, have basically 5 cycles that you have to keep track of. And I'm going to simplify it even more because I'm only going to really talk about the last 3. for the most part. So let's start with Lincoln. This is actually from the 1864 election. So this is Lincoln's reelection. This is during the Civil War now. And you can see that Lincoln won quite handedly. You can see that many of the states that are sort of blacked out or browned out, I guess, are the Confederate states, which are, obviously not participating in the election. I highlight this election here because I think this is an important moment in American history. This is 1864. The Civil War has been raging on for years now. By this point, the Emancipation Proclamation has come down. It is quite clear that the war is being fought to end slavery in the United States. And I think it says a lot that the American public, those who were able to vote at least, supported what was going on. Yes, famously, it has been argued, conclusively, I think, that the Civil War or Lincoln's, intention of fighting the war was not originally to end slavery. So let's be clear about that. In the words of Eric Foner, he kind of evolved on this issue. A term that people use commonly now. I wonder if Foner coined that term, to speak about a politician's changing on certain issues. Because now people say that all the time. Oh, they evolved on this issue, they evolved on that issue. But yes, Lincoln kind of evolved on the issue of slavery in the United States. He also evolved on the idea of political rights for the former slaves as well. And again, by this point, I think it had become quite clear that this is what the war is being fought for. And I think it is somewhat of a testament to the American public that they very much supported the efforts at this point to end slavery within the United States. It's somewhat, I think, of a credit to the government, to the Lincoln administration, that they even had an election. Lincoln possibly, this is debated by a lot of historians, but Lincoln possibly could have gotten away with suspending the election because the country was at war during that period of time. Certainly lesser figures. I mean, imagine if, Trump or Bush was in a situation like this. Certainly that they would have, seized upon, the pretext to declare some sort of, emergency powers, making them basically a virtual dictator of the United States. And true enough, Lincoln did, there are aspects of that did happen, the suspending of habeas corpus, shutting down pro-Confederate newspapers and things like that. There was definitely an expansion of power that Lincoln took hold of during this period of time. But they did at least have an election. Union soldiers were allowed to vote in the election. And I believe something like 70 to 80% of Union soldiers who voted in the election voted for Lincoln as well. I think that's a testament to the soldiers who fought in the Civil War, because they were the ones obviously actually doing the actual fighting. The Democrats at that point in time, the Democratic Party as a whole, was for this idea of a kind of negotiated peace. That let's just end the war. If we have to let Southerners keep their slaves, then we will. So I think it does say a lot that there was a strong rejection of this idea and an acceptance of the idea that the war has to be fought to a conclusion, and that conclusion is the end of slavery within the United States. Now, to be fair, McClellan, who was a former general, was also opposed to the idea of peace with the South and letting them keep their slaves. He was a candidate who was actually at odds with his party. And it is in fact true, though, that the Democratic Party as a whole was in favor of this idea of a negotiated peace. Just a little historical detail I want to include here. So the Reconstruction era, which follows the Civil War, in which of course Lincoln is assassinated, so he does not have much to do with that, is covered in pretty extensive detail by W.E.B. Du Bois in his book Black Reconstruction. I want to read a few passages from this book because I think it says a lot. The Reconstruction era is infamously, sort of a misunderstood era in American history. In fact, for the most part, it has a fairly negative connotation to it, even though it represents a radical attempt at undoing the evils, basically, of slavery and trying to, correct that to some limited fashion. So Du Bois writes here, you can see all of the page numbers, reference Du Bois's book. The Secretary of War was to issue necessary provisions, clothing, and fuel, and under the direction of the president, the commissioner could set aside for freedmen and refugees tracts of lands of not more than 40 acres to be leased to tenants. The lessees were to be protected in the use of land for 3 years at a low rent. At the end of the term, the tenant could purchase the land at an appraised value. This is the origins of the famous phrase, 40 acres and a mule, which was never actually, fulfilled. But the idea was to not just, I've kind of covered this to some extent in a previous class, but not just to provide for civil rights, not even just to provide for political rights, but to provide social rights, to redistribute land to the former slaves, to enable them to have some sort of economic standard of living. Fortunately, it did not come to pass, or if it did, it was quickly reversed. And the government agency, which basically carried this out, was known as the Freedmen's Bureau, by the way. And you can see it was a radical effort at providing a kind of social infrastructure here, building schools, re, redistributing land, things of that nature, as well as, of course, providing for the or protecting these civil and political rights of the former slaves. One of the early commissioners of the Freedmen's Bureau writes, in every state, many thousands were found without employment, without homes, without means of subsistence, crowding into towns and about military posts where they hoped to find protection and supplies. The sudden collapse of the rebellion, making emancipation an actual universal fact, was like an earthquake. It shook and shattered the whole previously existing social system. It broke up the old industries and threatened a reign of anarchy. Even well disposed and humane landowners were at a loss what to do or how to begin the work of reorganizing society and of rebuilding their ruined fortunes. Very few had any knowledge of free labor or any hope that their former slaves would serve them faithfully for wages. Others supposed that the government would either take the entire supervision of their labor and support or divide them among the lands of the conquered owners and furnish them with all that might be necessary to begin life as an independent farmer. So obviously, there was a big mess that had to be cleaned up here. I mean, to put it mildly. As I say, it was like an earthquake. It shook up the entire social structure of the society. The society had come to pieces, obviously, during the course of the Civil War, during the emancipation of slavery. And they basically had to, come in some way and try to, pick up the pieces, but not obviously just rebuild society back as it obviously was, but to rebuild society that now would allow for the freedom of the former slaves. So Du Bois writes here 12 labors of Hercules faced the Freedmen's Bureau to make as rapidly as possible a general survey of conditions and needs in every state and locality, to relieve immediate hunger and distress, to appoint state commissioners and upwards of 900 Bureau officials, to put the laborers to work at regular wage, to transport laborers, teachers, and officials, to furnish land for the peasant, to open schools, to pay bounties to black soldiers and their families, to establish hospitals and guard health, to administer justice between man and former master, to answer continuous and persistent criticism, North and South, black and white, to find funds to pay for all this. So again, transporting, teachers to teach in the schools, among various other things. These were among the tasks that had to be completed. In 4 years, the Bureau issued over 21 million rations to the hungry and unemployed, 15.5 million to blacks, and 5.5 million to whites. The number rose to 5 million in 1866 and then fell from 3.5 to 2.5 million in 1867 to 1868. The total cost of food and clothing, 1865 to 1871, was set down at a little over $3 million. So a lot, I mean, by those standards of the day, a lot. Du Bois goes on to say there were systematic plans to care for the sick. So again, the government taking on increasingly modern functions of government, not just this sort of limited so-called night watchman state, which is steps back and lets the private sector operate its magic. Now you have a government that has to provide food to people, to provide education, to care for sick, to provide some sort of rudimentary system of healthcare as well. In the summer of 1865, there were detailed in the several states 14 surgeons and 3 assistant surgeons who took care of white and black people in distress and engaged local surgeons to help them. You don't want to imagine, we don't want to imagine what surgery was like back then, but I think we all have seen some image of that, or have some idea of that. There wasn't anesthesia back then, other than drinking a lot of whiskey or having someone hit you over the head with a hammer, basically a mallet. By September 1867, there were 46 hospitals with 5,292 beds. The hospitals were distributed in 14 different states, and the annual appropriation for medical purposes was nearly $500,000 in 1866 and 1867. The total expenditure for the medical department has been estimated to have been $2 million. With this money, 452,000 roughly case. I'm sorry. With this money, 452,000 cases were treated, and perhaps an equal number unrecorded. In all, nearly 1 million people were given medical aid. The death rate among the freedmen was reduced from 30% to 13% in 1865 and to 2.03% in 1869. Something was done in providing physicians in large towns, inspecting sanitation, and treating lame, blind, deaf, and dumb, and aged persons and orphans. Temporary care was given to the insane. He goes on. Nearly 800,000 acres of farming land and about 5,000 pieces of town property were transferred to the Bureau by military and treasury officers, or taken up by assistant commissioners. Of this enough was leased to produce a revenue of nearly $400,000. Again, basically taking land and redistributing it, which has definite elements of a kind of socialistic government, if you would call it that. Du Bois, in fact, later on, refers to this as an attempt to create a kind of dictatorship of the proletariat in the South. Some farms were set aside as homes for the destitute and helpless, and a portion was cultivated by freedmen prior to its restoration. The necessary task of settling the Negroes on their own homesteads was begun by the Bureau, but soon rendered impossible by lack of land and funds and deliberately hostile executive action. Through the agency of the Bureau, the government paid out $8,000 in bounties to over 5,000 soldiers and their heirs, and thus helped furnish some capital for the new laborers. Howard estimated the total expenditure of our government for refugees and freedmen to August 31st, 1869, had been over $13 million. If we add to this the increase in the Army payroll caused by the Bureau and other items, Pierce estimates the total expenditure for the Bureau is between $17 million and $18 million. In its essence, the Bureau was a dictatorship of the Army over property for the benefit of labor, though later on he does actually use that term, the dictatorship of the proletariat. But basically, Du Bois rather sees this to be sort of an experiment in Marxist theory, as he says. To a few far-seeing leaders of democracy, this experiment appeared in its truer light. It was a test of the whole theory of American government. It was a dictatorship backed by the military arm of the United States, by which the governments of the southern states were to be coerced into accepting a new form of administration, in which the freedmen and the poor whites. So notice he looks at the lower classes not just as the freedmen, but of the poor whites as well. So the actual, again, laboring classes were now to hold power over the ruling class, the slave owners, in which the freedmen and the poor whites were to hold the overwhelming balance of political power. Now, to be fair, I mean, Du Bois's idea here is that simply giving voting rights to the freedmen and to the poor whites would be enough to sort of establish their kind of political dominance of labor over capital. Now we now live in a world, Du Bois is writing us in the 1930s. We now live in a world where those restrictions, to voting rights don't really exist to the same extent. Again, we do have some barriers to voting still, but that's certainly not ushered in, a dictatorship of the proletariat. So keep that in mind. As soon as political power was successfully delivered into the hands of these elements, the federal government was to withdraw and full democracy ensue. The difficulty was this theory was the failure to realize that such dictatorship must last long enough to really put the mass of workers in power, that this would be, in fact, a dictatorship of the proletariat, which must endure until the proletariat, or at least a leading united group with clear objects and effective method, had education and experience and had taken firm control of the economic organization of the South. Unfortunately, the power set to begin this dictatorship was the military arm of a government which more and more was falling into the hands of organized wealth, and of wealth organized on a scale never before seen in modern civilization. So, from Du Bois's point of view, it seems quite obvious why this experiment, this very radical social experiment, did not work out. It could only be carried out through, basically the force of the federal government, allowing for this kind of dictatorship of the proletariat to consolidate itself long enough to allow for, as he says, full uh, uh, democracy to take shape. But obviously, the commitment of the federal government to do so was waning as the federal government was increasingly falling under the control of the so-called robber barons, which took shape during the latter part of the 19th century. This was really the era where the United States becomes a more or less fully developed industrialized economy. And of course, the interest of that class is opposed to this, does not share the commitment to democracy in the South, obviously, if for nothing else, because they're also afraid of these ideas spreading to the North as well. So for Du Bois, at least, this is why the idea of Reconstruction was sort of doomed to failure, even though it was a very sort of ambitious um, experiment. So he goes on to say, particularly in the South, there is being put into force one of the most extraordinary experiments of Marxism that the world before the Russian Revolution had seen. That is backed by the military power of the United States. A dictatorship of labor was to be attempted, and those who were leading the Negro race in this vast experiment were emphasizing the necessity of the political power and organization backed by protective military power. But again, as we know, that did not work out. Now, some of the important laws which were passed by this point. Now, again, keep in mind, Congress at this time is under the sway of the so-called radical Republicans, people who were very much, committed to the idea of Reconstruction. Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, and a handful of others. But what happens? Lincoln gets assassinated. You now have Andrew Johnson as the president, a leading contender for the worst president in American history. And Johnson, I don't want to go into the whole thing, but Johnson comes into office and almost immediately starts to sort of sabotage Reconstruction, leading to basically the first time in which the Congress has to pass laws over the the presidential veto. So, for example, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which later became part of the groundwork for the 14th Amendment, granted citizenship for all. It granted citizenship to all persons born in the United States, except Native Americans. This, again, would form the foundation of the so-called birthright citizenship clause that you can find in the 14th Amendment, something which Trump has announced that he's going to do away with, though I don't see how he could legally do so since it is a part of the Constitution, establishing a clear federal standard that made Black American citizens with equal rights. So all former slaves and all Black Americans who were not slaves, who were also denied citizenship rights, would now be granted equal rights. Again, the act provided all citizens with the same legal rights, including the right to make contracts, sue and be sued, inherit, purchase, lease, sell, and convey property. It would allow the federal government to enforce these rights. Again, it was passed over presidential veto, basically marking the first time in which a law was passed over the presidential veto. Another bill, which was also passed over veto, was the Freedmen's Bureau bill, a bill to basically expand the life of the Freedmen's Bureau. So I won't go into detail about that, but basically, the many of the things which I already, detailed through reading the passages from Du Bois, many of the, enormous, what Du Bois calls Herculean tasks, which were entrusted to the Freedmen's Bureau, would then be basically, extended during this period of time. I mean, it's also worth pointing out what was known as the Black Codes back then. So part of the necessity for Reconstruction, and again, I don't want to go that much in depth to American history here. I do think it's important to give an overview of it, but um, almost as soon as the Civil War was over, the Southern governments basically went about trying to pass laws to reestablish slavery. You know, in everything but name. They wouldn't call it slavery anymore, but essentially reestablish the same kind of social structure through laws, which basically um, made it a crime for Black Americans not to have a job, that they would essentially have to go back to work for their former slave masters at a very low wage, or even in many cases no wages at all, and it literally became a crime. If you did not have some kind of certificate of employment, you would be arrested basically and put in jail, which then you would be then basically leased out as prison labor. So you kind of see the origins of that system, uh, developing out of this. Again, also passed over Johnson's veto. Of course, the Freedmen's Bureau was eventually disbanded in 1872. And of course, the Reconstruction era itself would basically end by about 1876. Usually, people date it the election of 1876, which brought into office a new President Rutherford B. Hayes. I kind of skipped over the Grant administration here. Again, I'm not trying to go that much in depth with the American history. Um, but the election of 1876 basically marks the end of the Reconstruction era. And then by the 1890s or so, most of the advances of the Reconstruction era were fully rolled back. Voting rights were taken away. The system of Jim Crow segregation became more or less fully ensconced in the South and would basically remain so until the Civil Rights Movement, which we've already covered to some extent as well. Um, but there was that sort of brief period of time where there was a significant attempt to actually create full equality in the United States, which I think deserves to be talked about. If for no other reason than the whole Reconstruction era tends to be very much maligned in American history and treated as if there's just this catastrophic failure. Anyway, so now moving on, we'll start to talk about the New Deal cycle now. So obviously there have been many books written on this, on all of these subjects, of course. One interesting book on the New Deal is a book by Ira Katznelson entitled "In Fear Itself: The New Deal and the Origins of Our Time." So what Katznelson argues is that the New Deal was limited by FDR's reliance on the Southern Democrats, or the Dixiecrats, as Malcolm X calls them. What this did basically is limited New Deal legislation from including more provisions to help African Americans. The reality is that African Americans weren't completely shut out of the New Deal, as Piven and Cloward talk about, for example. But it was, of course, severely limited. Um, the Dixiecrats were also, of course, very much against, for mobilization for war during World War II. So using that kind of leverage, by making, on the one hand, concessions to the Dixiecrats, but also sort of exploiting their patriotism, FDR was basically able to keep them as a unstable but at the same time fairly reliable group of support behind them. So the Dixiecrats did support the New Deal. They, of course, also supported the drive to war several years later. But this reliance on the Southern Democrats would not last that much longer. In fact, by the 1960s, the segregationist Southern Democrats had more or less broken free from the Democratic Party, and whereas the South was basically a blue area of the country up until then, has now basically consistently been a red part of the country, has gone for the Republican Party. But this so-called realignment of the parties does not take place until the 1960s. Now, Katznelson also argues, however, that there's kind of an ironic, or what we would say a kind of dialectical element to this, in that the New Deal, in that even though the Dixiecrats in the Congress attempted to exclude African Americans from the New Deal, they inadvertently set into motion the process that would sort of lead to the later civil rights movement. And of course, you can't really understand the New Deal without understanding the Great Depression, which really pushed into office, the most, probably still the most progressive administration in the history of the United States. I mean, no other administration really comes close in terms of what it did. And again, I can't really give a full accounting of everything that the New Deal did, but at the time, it was an unprecedented level of government intervention in the economy, not just to support capital, as has pretty much happened in every other presidential administration, but to support workers in the United States. Now, why was that the case? Was it because FDR was just a kind-hearted man that wanted to do something nice? Not really. The reality, of course, is that on the one hand, there was the rise of fascism in Europe, which alarmed maybe not the business interests of this country, which actually were quite okay with fascism, but certainly alarmed other segments of the political ruling class of the United States, including FDR, I'm sure. But of course, at this time, you also had a fairly strong socialist movement within the United States. You had, in fact, three fairly important socialist parties: the Communist Party, which was aligned with the Soviet Union, which, of course, at this time was quite active. The Soviet Union actually did fairly well during the Great Depression, whereas, of course, most of the other countries of the major countries of the world were all basically facing, the prospects of the Depression, the negative consequences of the Depression. So you had a Communist Party, you had the older Socialist Party, which was aligned with Eugene Debs in an earlier period of time. Now with what's the name, Norman Thomas, and you had the Socialist Workers' Party, which is basically followers of Leon Trotsky, who was one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution, but then famously became sort of opposed to Stalin, but not opposed to many of the ideas of the Russian Revolution and Lenin, including this idea of a vanguard party and things like that. So you had, and they were very active in the labor unions. They were very active in organizing, workers to go on strike. Again, Piven and Cloward also talk about this. They also talk about, of course, the inevitable, backlash and crackdown against it as early as the 1930s. Sheldon Wolin also talks about that as well. The backlash to the New Deal happened almost right away. It didn't just happen in the 1950s. It basically happened in the 1930s, almost as soon as it went into effect. But there was, I think, a real fear that yes, I mean these people trying to organize workers to go onto strike could cause a lot of problems. Whether or not they could actually achieve some kind of socialist revolution in the country is still a debated question. Many people, of course, think that was not necessarily in the cards. But there was certainly enough of a threat that it could cause some problems. So essentially, what I'm saying here is that basically the New Deal was a way to sort of head off this rising tide of socialist agitation within the United States. To essentially, again, do what Piven and Cloward do, or argue that political institutions are meant to do, is to sort of absorb the discontent that people have, to sort of funnel it into the sort of established institutions and processes of government, and to kind of dilute it and water it down to to some extent. And that's you could argue essentially what the New Deal did. I mean, many of the more radical aspects of the New Deal were directly pushed for by the socialist parties as well. So without that, I don't think you would have gotten a lot of the things that you got out of the welfare programs that you did get out of the New Deal, the works progress administration, things like that. The government actually employing people in these vast public projects, and even instituting things like price controls on certain things to keep the prices of things at a certain level, as well as wage controls also, by the way. Let's keep that in mind. And I don't want to over exaggerate how radical the New Deal was either. I mean, truthfully, I mean, many of the administrators of the New Deal were brought in from the corporate world. So many of the people who administered the New Deal programs were corporate executives also. So it was a very complicated movement that with people working at it at different ends of the political spectrum. You had agitation from below. You had people on the top trying to sort of contain this agitation in various ways. And again, I can't really do full justice to the complexity of the New Deal and everything that happened back then, but that's more or less a good sort of approximation, I think, of what went on. And of course, the New Deal program was very popular. So Roosevelt wins election in 1932 after the administration of Herbert Hoover, who was widely perceived as basically not doing anything. Right? So the Depression begins in 1929. Roosevelt's not elected until 1932. In between that period of time, the government is, seen to be basically just doing nothing, basically, sort of repeating this tired old, mantra of, basically let the market work itself out. We don't want the government to intervene. This is a violation of our liberal, political and economic principles, which we hold. We have to let the market work itself out. And of course, things were getting worse and worse and worse. So many people came to the view, of course, during this period of time, that the market could not get itself out of it, that basically some form of government intervention would be necessary. And you can see it was a popular idea. Now, whether or not the New Deal actually got the country out of the Great Depression fully is also another very debated idea. And I think there's a good argument they can make that, in fact, it did not. But it was a popular program. So this is Roosevelt's first reelection in 1936. You can see he wins basically by a landslide. In fact, Roosevelt wins almost every election by a landslide, as you can see here, almost the entire country, and even more so in 1936 and in 1932. Now, I don't have the maps from 1940 and 1944 up here. You can view them easily enough. It's not quite as much of a landslide victory as you see here in 1936, but still a pretty decisive win. And of course, Roosevelt is the only president in history to serve more than 2 terms in office. Another aspect I think makes the attempts to compare Biden to FDR kind of absurd. We're looking at a president who was elected for 4 terms in office versus a president who basically had to step down after 1 term because of popular pressure against him. And then, of course, his handpicked successor then loses the election. I mean that itself, I think, makes the claims of Biden being like FDR to be kind of absurd, frankly. But what do I mean by the fact that the New Deal did not actually bring the U.S. out of the Great Depression? Basically, what happens is that it is really World War II which brings the U.S. out of the Great Depression. Basically, on the eve of the U.S. getting involved in the war in 1941, unemployment in the United States was still about 10% of the country, which is very high. And that's only based on official numbers, right? Unofficially, it was probably even much higher than that. So the fact is that even after almost 10 years of the New Deal, vast amounts of the country was still unemployed. I mean, you could, some people would argue this is because in the latter part of the 1930s, the Supreme Court started getting involved and, striking down certain parts of the New Deal as being unconstitutional. You could make that argument, perhaps, but the fact is that yeah, by late 1941, the country was not fully recovered from the Depression at all. And it really was the wartime transformation of the economy that really fully got the country out of the depression once and for all. That's what finally opened up all of the factories, put all the people to work. Of course, you have a large portion of the workforce, which is then shipped off overseas to fight in the wars. That's where you see Rosie the Riveter, women being employed in factories, African Americans being employed in factories. It was the war which truly got the U.S. out of the depression. And unfortunately, the lesson learned from that was that basically, the U.S. economy would forevermore be highly dependent, which it is to this very day, on the military. Maybe not as much as people make it out to be, but certainly to a significant extent. In fact, after the war, they tried to demilitarize the economy, and the U.S. quickly went into major recession in the late 1940s. Then basically, with the Korean War, that sort of brought the economy out of that again. And then, yeah, like basically, if there was any doubt at that point, then it really became instilled in people's heads that the U.S. economy would forever after have to depend on the military. And that's not to say that this kind of military spending is a beneficial thing. It creates lots of contradictions in the economy as well. Unfortunately, again, I have to can only give somewhat of a brief overview of this. So the next election I'd like to turn to is the 1964 election of Lyndon Johnson over Barry Goldwater. So we skipped the 1960 election. We're skipping other elections, obviously. Johnson, you can see, also wins in a landslide. And this is based on probably a lot of, sympathy over the assassination of JFK, as well as his endorsement of the Civil Rights Act, and as well as his, um, you know, proposals to launch what would be then became known as the Great Society. And in many ways, Johnson could be considered to be the true heir to FDR. It again is under the Johnson administration where you see, the creation of things like Medicare and Medicaid and HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So those are very significant things. The so-called War on Poverty is launched during the Johnson administration. The last time in which any, presidential administration has, declared something as bold as that. The government was going to eliminate poverty in this country. Of course, it failed to do so. It did reduce poverty, though, by a significant amount. But as you can see, Johnson's endorsement of civil rights cost them some support in the South. As we'll see, this will get a lot worse as the years go by. So this also basically begins the transformation of the South from a Democratic stronghold into a Republican stronghold. And of course, the major issue here is the embrace of the Democratic Party over the issue of civil rights, whereas basically maintained itself since then. Like, you can question its sincerity and its genuine motivation to improve the living standards for African Americans within the United States also. But again, Johnson also, if anything, I would compare Biden to Lyndon Johnson, maybe. Because interestingly enough, Lyndon Johnson also was able to run in 1968 and did briefly consider it, but stepped down because of his unpopularity. I would say that's a much more apt comparison to make between Biden and Lyndon Johnson then. Why had Lyndon Johnson become so unpopular by 1968? So within 4 years, he goes from being incredibly popular president to basically a pariah who has to again step down because to essentially save himself the embarrassment of losing. Well, it was basically the Vietnam War, and this reflects again to some extent the contradiction in the U.S. economy between its dependence on military spending and the social cost of maintaining the so-called military industrial complex, pointed out by people like of all people, Eisenhower, who essentially coined the term, but has been pointed out by many other figures since then. I won't get into the whole Cold War conflict, but the U.S. increasingly gets itself involved in a series of wars during this period of time. Ostensibly fought to contain communism or to roll back so-called communist aggression in various parts of the world. I think suffice to say, I think most of these conflicts were basically not necessary conflicts the United States needed to get itself involved in, and really speaks more to the idea of the U.S. sort of extending itself as this kind of global imperialistic power. And I'll say something else. I think probably a lot of people will find to be controversial, but I think is in fact true. There is probably, in fact, there is no more destructive country in the world since Nazi Germany than is the United States. The United States has rained more death and and destruction upon the rest of the world um, in those intervening years than any other country. No other country comes close to that. Not even the Soviet Union. I mean, just look at the death toll from U.S. wars since then. The Vietnam War kills between 3 and 5 million people. The Korean War kills about 3 million people. If you add up the death toll from wars fought since 2001, according to the Watson Institute at Brown University, something like 4 million people. Now they include indirect deaths in that. So what does that mean? That means, say, the United States blows up a hospital in Iraq, kills all the people in the hospital, but then other people who then die after that because they can no longer go to the hospital are included in that death toll. Now, is that fair to include them? Or to give another example, the U.S. bombs, a water treatment plant, and the water gets contaminated, people get sick and die from that. Is the United States responsible for those deaths? I would say yes. So I would say yeah, it is fair and accurate to include that amount. So the United States has, frankly, killed millions and millions of people, probably in the tens of millions of people since the end of World War II. And that's just part of the legacy that people have to grapple with in this country. Many people don't want to, or pretend that somehow you can excuse all this by saying, "Well, we were fighting for a good cause," or something like that. Well, what was that cause? I mean, even if that was true, it still does not excuse it. And I don't think the cause itself was good to begin with, because it was really just about expanding U.S. power overseas. And that's a good point to talk about the election of Ronald Reagan, which then begins the so-called Reagan cycle, which is almost like the inversion of the New Deal cycle. If the New Deal was about, you know, increased expenditures on social welfare, raising taxes on the wealthy to pay for that, the Reagan cycle is like the opposite. We're going to cut back on social welfare spending, not cut back on military spending. The U.S. budget will continue to increase. The U.S. budget, the deficit also will continue to increase, but we're going to cut back on social welfare spending, and we're going to cut taxes. Obviously, probably the most important legacy of the Reagan administration. Particularly on the wealthy. So you can see here that Reagan also basically wins landslide election victories. We can see him in 1980 against Carter, 1984 as well. So by that point, what had happened? The New Deal had kind of run out of steam. Carter is generally considered to be the last of the New Deal presidents, the last in the so-called New Deal cycle. Although already under him, let's be clear, the shift to a more sort of right wing, a right wing shift in the government was already taking place. But this also obviously continued and accelerated under Reagan and under future presidents as well. That's why I said at the beginning of class that today's Democratic Party has a much more in common with Ronald Reagan than it does with Franklin Roosevelt. And you see this quite clearly, I think, in the Clinton administration, which is closest, obviously, to the Reagan administration chronologically. Almost all the significant things that Clinton did as president basically represent conservative goals. These include things like NAFTA, the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement, welfare reform, which is really gutting welfare in this country, kicking millions of people off of welfare. The crime bill, which most people point to as the single law most responsible for the mass incarceration state in the United States, deregulating finance, which has created an increasing amount of financial speculation in the economy, deregulating the media as well, which has led to essentially a handful of corporations controlling almost all of the media in this country as well. Now you can see, once again, I provided some pretty detailed descriptions of what these things are. I'm not going to read all of it or really any of it, to be honest with you, to not make this too intensive to go through. But again, the basic idea of NAFTA is that it led to significant outsourcing outside the United States, led to many manufacturing jobs being eliminated here within the United States. I don't see how you can see that's a pro-worker policy. And in fact, something like NAFTA was already in the works under the Reagan and then the Bush administration following, but really sort of came to its conclusion under Clinton. Gutting welfare in this country. If you want to read, of course, you can read the PowerPoint and you can read a more detailed description of these things. I just want to give sort of a brief overview of it. But you can see what these things are. And I don't see how anyone could read this and not conclude that these are basically very sort of, right-wing, presidential accomplishments, quote unquote. So how we exited the New Deal cycle. I would argue that we have not. And the reason for that is I think, beyond the rhetorical flourishes, the symbolic gestures towards, diversity and things like that you hear from the Democratic Party, the core economic structures of the United States has not significantly changed since Ronald Reagan became president of the United States. One of the things, of course, is, and I'm not going to go over things I've already gone over in previous classes, things that I think are pretty commonly known now anyway. But of course, the level of inequality in the United States has continued to increase. More and more wealth is concentrated, not just in the hands of the top 1% of the economy, but really in the 0.011% of the economy. Taxes on, again, I've shown graphs on that in previous classes as well. Tax rates on the highest income earners continue to be very low. So though if those are core, features or core aspects of the Reagan administration, then those things have not really changed at all. Another thing, of course, is the growth of finance in the economy as well, the so-called FIRE sector of the economy. But another thing, and all these things I pointed out, prior to this, but another thing I think I would like to point out is the slowdown in the productivity of the United States economy. So this graph here shows you basically productivity growth in the United States since 1947. And you can see that while it has continued to increase overall, the pace at which it has increased slows down. You can see by the flattening of the curve here that the U.S. economy, that the productivity of the U.S. economy is slowing down. Now, what that means, of course, is this has a direct impact on the wages, the living standards of people in this country as well. It also illustrates a key contradiction in the economy between, again, the idea of productivity and profitability that Marx first talked about. What that means basically is that as the rate of profit in the U.S. economy slows down, so does the growth in productivity in the economy. Basically, when the overall rate of profit is slowing down, companies invest less in productivity, and that of course slows down the growth of the economy. It slows down the growth in wages and other things that people you know depend on basically for their living standards. So you can see that so-called labor productivity, which basically is the um, measured by the overall output of the economy, divided by the amount of hours worked in the economy, which you can get basically through official government sources and statistics, has markedly, slowed down over the last several years, over the last several decades, in fact. Here's another chart here. Basically, it shows you labor productivity and total factor productivity here. Now, I'll sort of break this down a little bit here. So, what this means basically, labor productivity in the United States peaks around 4 to 5% in the early 1960s, showing strong growth during the post World War II boom. Again, the U.S. economy was booming coming out of World War II, though, of course, to a large extent, based upon its dependence on military spending, as well as the fact that, of course, most of the rest of the world was, bombed to hell basically during World War II, right? The United States emerges as the only country relatively unscathed in terms of its industrial infrastructure, at least completely unscathed after World War II. So, of course, the U.S. economy is booming during this period of time. The economy is growing very nicely. The productivity again of the economy is growing about 4 to 5% every year until about the early 1960s. It declined steadily through the 1970s, hitting a low in the early 1980s before recovering in the 1990s. However, even during the 1990s, the productivity boom does not reach the level seen in the 1950s and 1960s. After 2000, the trend again shows a gradual decline, reflecting a long-term slowdown. Now, that's one measurement, labor productivity. Another is what they call total factor productivity is here as well. Now, what that does is it basically is meant to capture the overall efficiency of the economy, how well the economic inputs, capital and labor, are sort of being used in the economy. It's a much more sort of elusive term to a certain extent. Labor productivity is sort of easier to sort of track and measure. But anyway, TFP, as it's known, captures broader efficiency improvements in technological innovations. Its slower growth suggests that much of the U.S. productivity gains were driven by adding more inputs, for example, labor and capital, rather than slowly from efficiency or innovation. So really, at all points, the U.S. economy has relied more just by, it's never been a particularly efficient economy. It's basically, gotten by on the large sides of its economy, which should not be that surprising, I would think, to most people. It starts lower than labor productivity and remains subdued throughout the period. Peaks in the 1950s and 60s, but experiences a pronounced decline during the 1970s and 80s. The recovery in the 1990s is weaker compared to labor productivity, and TFP growth continues to lag into the 2000s. Now, what are the broader implications of this slowdown? Basically, the decline in TFP growth suggests that the economy is becoming less efficient in utilizing inputs, slower innovation, and diminishing returns on investment in technology and capital could be contributing factors. So, a diminishing return on investment. So, again, as the profit rate declines, investors become less likely to invest further in technology, which is, I think, something that which does go against the grain of a lot of what people think. We always think of ourselves as this major high tech economy, and we're so advanced. The reality is that yes, while your phones may be increasingly getting advanced, or whatever, even people kind of make fun of that. Even the gains from that seem to be slowing down. The actual improvements in utilizing technology to produce things is kind of slow. We don't actually really invest all that much into improving how we produce things anymore. Slower labor productivity growth directly impacts wage growth and living standards as it limits how much workers can produce and earn over time. The 1970s slowdown aligns with events like the oil shocks, stagnation, again a slowing rate of profit in the economy, as well as inflation as well, which hindered productivity growth. Now, what caused productivity growth to improve? The late 1990s boom was driven by technological advancements, for example, IT and computers, but this effect seems to have faded past post 2000, possibly due to a plateau in productivity gains from these innovations. So the bulk of the improvements that we've gotten from technology like IT and computers has already kind of hit its peak. And really over the last, several years or so has been again kind of slowing down. What the graph shows, the third one in particular, clearly shows that U.S. productivity growth is slowing over the long term. While there are short-term recoveries, like the 1990s boom, the overall trend is downward. The slowdown raises concerns about economic growth, living standards, and the ability of the U.S. to sustain its competitive edge in the global economy. So, alongside growing inequality, I would also argue that this long-term slowdown in the U.S. economy is another major factor. And even though it was partially revived during the 1990s, those gains have, again, sort of, faded away since then. Now, what was really sort of driving those gains as well? Yes, and things like IT and computers was important as well, but other things like, once again, outsourcing jobs was significant. The Reagan administration was famous for cracking down on workers, breaking strikes of workers, like the famous air traffic controller union strike, forcing workers, especially in unions, to accept substandard contracts, which limited their wage increases. Well, if you can prevent workers' wages from increasing over time, you can extract more and more surplus value out of them. Again, as Marx would argue. Another thing is again the growth in the finance sector, which really accelerates during the 1980s. So these are all characteristics of the Reagan years, which continue into this very day. But the finance sector or the fire sector, again, doesn't really create new wealth. It doesn't create new value. It doesn't really produce anything. What it does basically is it kind of just sucks in wealth created in other sectors of the economy. So it creates what some people literally call fictitious profits. It literally creates fake, imaginary profits, which seems like economic growth, but it's really just sort of sucking in wealth created in other parts of the economy, and it's actually hurting other parts of the economy because it is sucking in their wealth, basically, forcing higher costs on them, higher debt servicing costs on them, while it records it as profits for itself. So these are not good things. And the advantages that the U.S. gets out of outsourcing and things like that seems to be sort of reaching its limit now with the rise of China as a competitor to the United States. You can't keep workers' wages stagnant and anymore. More and more workers are going on strike. So the ways in which the U.S. has tried to revive its economy since the 1980s, those means seemingly are hitting their limit, and in fact have already hit their limit. And what you see is a rapidly slowing U.S. Economy, because of that. And I think this also, by the way, sort of cuts through all the the nonsense over Bidenomics and all of this other stuff. I mean, Bidenomics didn't do anything really to address these core issues, which again, according to Marxist economists, would be mostly traced to a fall in the rate of profit in the U.S. economy. Now, I've already shown graphs to support that in the past as well. That's why I'm not showing it here. But the logic, behind it again is that if the rate of profit falls to a low enough level, then corporations don't have an incentive to invest more, and that of course slows the growth of the overall economy. That's the basic idea. And the rate of profit is sluggish and low. Outside of a handful of corporate monopolies in the technology world, particularly like Google and Facebook, and outside of, the fire sector, which again is basically creating, phony profits for itself, the rest of the economy is not doing all that well. So how do you raise the rate of profit? According to Marx, you can only really do this through what he calls the destruction of capital value. Well, what is that? Basically, one of two things. One, you devalue assets, which nobody wants to do. Obviously, people who own these assets don't want to see these assets devalued, or the actual, literal physical destruction of production and assets, which is basically what happened during World War II. The reason why the U.S. economy starts out very high after World War II, is because it escaped from the war relatively unscathed, but the whole rest of the world, the whole rest of the industrialized world, was annihilated essentially. Particularly the industrial infrastructure of these countries. So the profit rate had almost nowhere else to go but up during that period of time. Of course, the whole world economy, not just the U.S. economy, benefits during this period of time. But since then, since the rest of the world has sort of rebuilt its industry, basically, you've seen the profit rate go down and down and down. And efforts to stop that process through outsourcing, through finance, phony profits, and things like that, have sort of reached its peak. So I would argue that these are very long-term structural trends, which are very concerning. And any nonsense over Bidenomics or anything like that, or especially the idea that Trump is going to come in and wave a magic wand and fix everything. Also, these are equally delusional fantasies, basically, and doesn't even begin to deal with the long-term issues here. Here you can see quite clearly, U.S. economic growth has significantly slowed since the 1950s. On the other hand, China's economy continues to grow and drastically outpaces the U.S. economy, even as its economy begins to hit problems as well. But that's a whole another topic, of course. But I would also argue that China, as its productivity increases, is beginning to run into problems. Not to mention all the other problems that you have in China. But its economy, continues to outpace U.S. economic growth. It is increasingly catching up to the U.S. economy. It is now, grown larger than any other economy in the world, except for the United States. And there are even different ways of measuring economic growth, which in some ways do place China as the highest. I think in many ways this fuels, the current conflict that we see between the United States and China. It has very little to do with national security, a very vague and ambiguous term, but has a lot to do with things like this, as well as the fact that the U.S. gains less, profit out of trade with China as well, which of course has been a major part of the U.S. economy since the 1980s. The so-called transfer of surplus value out of China into the United States economy through international trade and things like that. Those advantages are starting to wane away, and I think that's what's mostly driving conflict here. Anyway. I'll close out just looking at the last three elections real quickly. I'm sorry, this map is a little bit blurry here. Maybe I'll try to fix that. But here you see, Clinton and Trump in 2016. Here you see Biden and Trump in 2020. And here you see Harris and Trump in 2024. Now, what you'll notice in these three elections is the shifting of certain of the Midwestern industrial states to Trump. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania all go to Trump in 2016 and 2024, but not in 2020. Now, there are other states, that matter as well, like Georgia and a few others. New Mexico is another one. Nevada is another one as well. You'll also know, if you look very, very closely at it, you'll see that there's shift in the electoral votes from each state as well, because the 2020 election was done before the readjustment from the 2020 census. So you'll see that the electoral votes of some of these states has changed as well. But I would argue, again, a key reason for Trump's success is that he's been able to reach out to workers, particularly in these very economically distressed Midwestern industrial states. These are the states that have literally had their jobs, outsourced over over overseas. And unlike certain states in the Northeast or on the West Coast that have more diversified economies, these states do not have as much of a diversified economy. They are much more dependent on these industrial jobs, which are, they're just not coming back. Even if you stop outsourcing, which you're not going to do, most of the loss of manufacturing jobs has been due through automation anyway. So, I mean, there are so many factors here that, like I said, cut through any illusion that any politician is going to do anything to fix these things, because these things really deal with core fundamental aspects of how a capitalist economic system works itself. And, the conditions were much more favorable coming out of World War II, continuing on through the 1960s. But basically, what you're seeing is a decline of American capitalism basically since the 1970s. And at best, they've been able to come up with very temporary measures to sort of stop this process of decline. But you're seeing that their attempts to do so are rapidly fading away. So I think that's more or less where I'll leave things now. Hopefully, that's some food for thought for people to consider, because those are very important questions that have to be dealt with. And I would argue that neither political party even comes close to dealing with any of these issues. Okay, so with that being said, take care, everyone, and we'll pick this up next class.